Good afternoon, and welcome to Building a Better Tomorrow, the fight to ensure environmental sustainability, part of MDG 500. My name is Molly Elgin-Cossart. I'm the Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., and I'll be your moderator today. Today, August 18th, marks 500 days to the target date for achieving the Millennium Development Goals, and is an important moment to raise awareness of the gains we've made and build momentum for further progress over the next 500 days and beyond. Throughout the day, you can go to mdg500.org to learn about and participate in 500 minutes of programming, with 1 hour for each MDG. This hour, we focus on MDG 7, Ensure Environmental Sustainability. MDG 7 has 4 components: reversing the loss of environmental resources, reducing reduction in the rate of loss, having the proportion of people without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation, and achieving significant improvement in the lives of slum dwellers. I'm especially excited to be talking about MDG 7 today because it covers a mix of basic development needs, national priorities, and global public goods, such as climate. It contains some great areas of success and other areas where the failure to act is driving potential crises. Our panel today has incredible breadth and depth of experience with the issues covered in MDG 7. We're joined today by Susan McPherson, corporate social responsibility expert and host of #CSRChat on Twitter, Naysan Sabha, spokesperson for the UN Environment Program, and Liz Thompson, former Minister for Energy and Environment of Barbados, former executive coordinator for the Rio+20 conference, and current senior advisor for the UN Sustainable Energy for All initiative. I'm going to turn to our panelists now. As I mentioned, MDG 7 contains some remarkable successes, including a 98% reduction in the global consumption of ozone-depleting substances, and the proportion of the population with access to safe drinking water has increased from 76% to 89%, achieving the objective of having the proportion of the population without access to basic drinking water and basic sanitation. These are some incredible successes, but I want to look to our panelists now and ask you what strikes you about the success and progress with MDG 7. Perhaps we can start with you, Susan.
Because I'm the one sitting and smiling, correct?
Exactly. You looked like you had something to say.
Well, I mean, honestly, we've seen a lot of success happening both at the local and country level, with governments adopting their own regulations, and innovative companies' technology emerging in unison, along with nonprofits. The goals have been clear and universal, but the implementation, for the most part, has been grassroots, which I think is ultimately helping drive a successful model for change. And I think just in the last few years, you have seen business to get much, much more involved. And I know we're going to get into businesses' involvement in Rio+20, but just over the last few years since that gathering, we've seen a spike in leadership from companies on this particular MDG.
Liz, do you have any comments about that? Maybe the segue?
I think that what should strike us is the incredible gaps in some of the implementation, or in the implementation in some of the goals. There have been tremendous successes, for instance, in increasing drinking water, not on MDG 7, but certainly one of the ones that is the most striking would be access to education for girls. On MDG 7, it would be things like improving sanitation and stopping deforestation. But on others, there is a high level of concern. The constant demographic changes resulting in influxes into cities, and therefore the number of slum dwellers who, even though there are large numbers that have been taken out of very severe conditions, there are still large numbers coming into cities and going into conditions that are less than desirable. So I think one of the issues that we have to confront would really be what has resulted in tremendous success in some MDGs, and less success in others. And even within single MDGs, like MDG 7, you have great successes on some areas, and then you're seeing still the kind of difficulty that we're trying to be rid of persisting. So that suggests that there are structural problems that we have not really addressed.
Yeah, really good point. And it's absolutely true that while I said there have been incredible successes, MDG 7 is so fascinating because it contains both some of the greatest successes, such as on the reduction of the consumption and ozone-depleting substances, but also what is arguably the only MDG target where progress has been moving in the wrong direction, carbon emissions. So it's a really interesting microcosm of the challenges we face. Naysan, maybe I'll turn to you. For UNEP, I'm sure that you all do a lot of thinking and communicating about what are the greatest successes, but also tell us a little bit about where is more action needed.
Thank you. I think you've mentioned probably the one success that's stands out to me. I've been with UNEP for about 9 months now, and I remember that as I was entering the organization, the news about the success of the Montreal Protocol, this environmental treaty that sort of has witnessed. Now, admittedly, it came into effect well before the MDGs, but sort of gained momentum and achieved sort of its universalization over the course of the MDGs, and certainly in developing countries after 2000. This is one of those protocols that has been sort of the fruits of the labors of UNEP, of the United Nations system coming together, trying to sort of achieve global consensus, global action around these things. And I think, from a story perspective, I was wrapping up high school in the late 80s when greenhouse gases sort of captured the popular imagination. And with all of the sort of environmental issues and a lot of the issues that are enshrined in MDG 7, such as biodiversity loss, carbon emissions, sustainable development. I mean, one of the challenges with MDG 7 is perhaps some of the fuzziness around around the goals and targets. But also, I mean, these are possibly the most epic goals that are captured by all of the Millennium Development Goals. They are arguably some of the most universal goals, where other goals are, as we enter the end game, perhaps the more successful ones are really reaching out to the most unreached, the most marginalized communities in different parts of the world, often in developing contexts and southern contexts. MDG 7 and the environmental implications of the Millennium Development Goals as a whole are truly universal. They aren't the problems of the poor, they aren't the problems of the South, and that, I think, is an important sort of dual challenge and opportunity that has been afforded us by the MDGs and by some of the successes that we've achieved, and we need to keep our eyes on as we sort of look at some of the great challenges, such as carbon emissions and achieving consensus and actual tangible commitments to some of these bigger goals. So ozone depletion, the global consumption of ozone depleting substances, what we've achieved there, and in such a a blink of time, it really doesn't feel that long in the global scheme of things, are remarkable. And I think they're the kinds of things that need to sort of be our point of departure as we look at the significant areas of action that are still needed, and urgently so, in the environmental space.
Mm-hmm. If I can say, to paraphrase Sharon Burrows, there are no jobs with a dead planet. So your point about the fact that MDG 7 reaches the entire populace, from the bottom of the pyramid to the top boardrooms of corporate America, and certainly globally, I think that quote says it all.
Absolutely. And this all brings out a really good point, which is MDG 7 in some ways, well, one, this is a problem for all of us, as you said, and in some ways, it presages the next, beyond the next 500 days, the next set of development goals and the sustainable development goals, which are still, being formulated, but we know that it looks like they'll be more universal, so they'll be addressing problems for everyone, things that affect every country, and also that they're aiming to integrate economic, social, and environmental issues. Now, we know that the idea of the SDGs came about at Rio+20, so I want to look at Liz now and then ask Susan and Naysan, you to pipe in a bit about what excites you about the next set of goals and how can we build up in the next 500 days, knowing that MDG 7 is really, I think, a precursor to the entire next set of goals. What can we do, and also how can we really make sure to maximize the impact of the next 500 days and the SDGs?
That's a big load of questions.
All right, Liz, tell us a little bit about the SDGs, since you were the executive coordinator at the Rio+20 conference. What are they?
The SDGs are a set of goals that are intended to replace at the end of 2015, when the MDGs come to an end, the SDGs are the goals that will replace them. They do cover the gamut of development areas, society, social, economic, and environmental, which I think is a very good thing, because part of the challenge I think we have with the sustainability debate is that for many people, particularly some ministers of finance and economic affairs, they see sustainability issues as being exclusively environmental, whereas the linkages with society and economy are not necessarily readily made. So for me, the greatest excitement is that the SDGs do span the 3 pillars of development in a way that the MDGs did not, and therefore there is likely to be a greater multi-sectoral and cross-disciplinary approach. For me, it is also very exciting, as somebody who works in energy, that areas like energy and water have made it into the MDGs in a way that, into the SDGs, in a way that they were not showcased at all and didn't make it onto the list of 8 MDGs. So I think that that's really exciting, the breadth of the MDGs and of the SDGs, and the fact that critical elements of development which did not appear in the MDGs are now to be had in the SDGs. At the same time, however, I think that there is for me a concern, which is part of the beauty of the MDGs was their very simplicity. The fact that it was a list of 8 with which people easily and readily identified, they were easy to know, to repeat. When you have 17 goals and I think 179 targets for these goals, it's going to become far more complex in terms of developing, enabling policy and implementation frameworks. It is going to be far more difficult for stakeholders to remember them all. And I think that people are going to sort of cherry pick. They're going to go for the ones that are more relevant to them or that they may think are easier. There is some good in that, insofar as it will allow each country to address the issues that are critical to their national or regional circumstances. One example will suffice. In the MDGs, malaria and HIV/AIDS were one of the big critical health issues that were targeted. However, in the Pacific and the Caribbean, and I'm citing SIDS because the SIDS conference is coming up. So in the Pacific and the Caribbean, and of course for many developed countries, NCDs, chronic non-communicable diseases, really are the big health issue, far more so than malaria. So that the fact that the NCDs, for instance, are now contained in a health goal really allows then those countries which are, have this as one of their priority areas because it is a major cause of morbidity and mortality in their country or in their region, they can now focus on that. So I think there are some good things in the list of SDGs itself. I quite like the list. I love the way the targets are multi-sectoral and multi-dimensional, but I think that there will be challenges in remembering, in marketing, in implementation. And therefore, the development of roadmaps and strategic support for developing countries, particularly small island developing states and LDCs, where there are going to be human resource, institutional, regulatory and legal capacity issues, that is going to become all the more difficult.
Liz, just to explain to anyone who doesn't know, LDCs being least developed countries.
Yes.
Just want to make sure.
Those are small island developing states. Yes.
There you go. So that's a great summary and a great snapshot. You mentioned the challenges of communication. So as spokesperson, Naysan, I'm going to turn to you. What are the main messages to make sure that we get action in the next 500 days and, as Liz points out, beyond for the next set of goals? What are the main messages to get out there?
You know, I suppose a crucial message is one of urgency. 500 days is a significant period of time. It's also a blink of an eye in the broader scheme of the 15-year project that we've called the MDGs ever since the Millennium Declaration. But these next 500 days need to be imbued with a tremendous urgency that certainly we felt in the United Nations system and in the environmental space, most recently at the historic first Universal United Nations Environment Assembly that had convened here in Nairobi, Kenya, and which will now carry on into Samoa with the third International Conference on Small Island Developing States, which will sort of be, again, a leap pad into the Secretary General's Climate Summit and Climate Week in New York, all of which will lead into two major conference of parties, one in Peru later this year, and ultimately, right at the close of the Millennium Development Goal project, the Conference of Parties, the UNFCCC conference in Paris. And I think that the world's leadership, certainly the Secretary General, certainly all the players within the UN system and its member states are anxious and see this next 18-month period as a crucial timeline within which significant things, building on the latest evidence, all of which suggests that the pace of our successes, whether in the context of MDG 7 or beyond them, are not adequate to the manic growth of the planet currently, the manic needs of the planet, the trajectories that we're on, which simply speak a different discourse than sustainability. And I think that's really kind of the message that underlies each of these different facets of the work that we're doing, whether it's small island developing states, which is a crucial theme of the upcoming conference, which was the theme of World Environment Day earlier in June this year. The planet looked at the sort of the solidarity that we need to bring as a world to these several dozen countries that are at the forefront. Will be the first victims, if you will, of inaction in the face of climate change. So I think urgency is one of those crucial things. The other one that we've just heard from Liz, is sort of the necessity for for integration, the clear sense of interconnectedness between all these dimensions of development. I think we went into the MDGs with naysayers, with people who thought that anything environmental would come at the cost of economic development. I think the evidence is now irrefutable that there can be no economic development, social development, without a very, very intrinsic attention paid to the environmental dimension. And this is what the data is beginning to show us. I mean, the story is clear that we're going into we have 7 billion people currently on the planet, and the anxiety is how we might feed a planet of 10 billion people if some of the projections that we hit 10 billion by mid-century come true. When you look at the implications in terms of food loss, food waste, in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of water, in terms of energy, and then link all of that to the data we see, for example, on air pollution now, where we're saying that the WHO is showing that in 2012, 7 million people died prematurely because of air pollution. About half of them from household air pollution. This is energy. So the interlinkages between air quality, energy, feeding ourselves, our families, gender, all of these things are one of, I think, the outcomes at the level of discourse of the MDGs, and I'm glad to see, the world sort of straining to formulate the Sustainable Development Goals in ways that will be imbued with an integrative approach and one that might have more urgency than we've seen before.
Molly, if I could just jump in. With only 500 days, as much as my two brilliant colleagues on the panel are providing all sorts of ideas, time is of the essence, and my fear is we have to make things simple for people to understand, because the vast majority of the world don't understand what United Nations speak. They don't understand policy talk, and they really just need to understand, what does this mean for me in my backyard? What does this mean for me in my day-to-day job? And what does this mean for me and my children? So, the fastest way to get there, at least in the most efficient, is to make sure we're putting pressure on business. Companies touch every party involved here. They influence the general public, they provide funding to nonprofits, and they can lobby more effectively than individuals, government officials. They can play a huge role in how healthy our environment is through our own operations. So with such a limited time left to really push to see results, specifically in MDG 7, I would advise that we really get behind business and force business to work together. And we're starting to see that. I mean, there's new organizations that have been formed, such as We Mean Business, certainly the B Team, and some of these other organizations are pushing. But I do think let's try to keep it as simple as possible so people really understand what this all means.
Great points. And you also touch on partnerships. So certainly, yes, with such ambitious goals, something really important to make sure we have maximum impact is we're all working together on these common problems. So partnerships, you mentioned private sector, obviously also civil society, vulnerable communities themselves, governments. And in that light, actually, Liz, maybe I'll look to you again. Can you give us an example? You are a senior advisor for Sustainable Energy for All. How do partnerships bring together, how do partnerships come together in SC for All?
Well, because we recognize the critical importance of energy to development, to quality of life, to poverty eradication, and the connection with the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. We try to develop partnerships with all kinds of organizations, whether they're private sector, civil society, academia, the international agencies, private capital. So that, for instance, part of what we are doing is trying to help to bring private capital to countries that are interested in developing sustainable energy frameworks and need to develop the roadmaps to transition from total fossil fuel-based economy to an economy that has a larger degree of green energy. Equally, partnerships pertaining to increasing energy efficiency, and again that means looking for the appropriate technologies, linking companies and capital with the countries and the politicians. And a lot of what we really do is advocacy, sensitization, and education. remember that prior to 2011, when the SG launched the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, energy was not discussed in the context of a nexus. It wasn't discussed in relation to the critical linkage to climate change, and the critical linkage to water, and the critical linkage to agriculture, and the critical linkage to gender, and the critical linkage to health and women and transport and so on. And therefore what we are trying to do is to bring all parties to the table to have discussions about how we can work together to discuss the overarching goals of sustainable energy for all, which are to have universal access for energy. There's something like 1.5 billion people in the world who have no access to energy. Naysan was making the point about the number of people who died as a result of poor air quality. And again, that is an energy issue because many of these people are using biomass and harmful substances which cause rhinotracheal and respiratory infections and diseases, and they end up in very poor health, unable to work to contribute to the growth of the economy. They end up really losing their lives, particularly women and young children who are the ones who are the most exposed. So therefore, at Sustainable Energy for All, we see energy as the significant cross-cutting and overarching development issue. And so we are trying to ensure that there's universal access to modern and safe energy, that we increase the degree of energy efficiency through improved new technologies, and that we improve and increase the level of renewable energy technologies being used by people all over the world. That is the critical transition that we're trying to make.
Thanks so much, Liz. That's fantastic. So SD for All is one really exciting example of a partnership. Susan, I know you do a lot of work with, especially the private sector and partnerships. Do you have any particular examples you want to draw out that are really good examples?
Sure. And I have to say, yes, I work very closely with corporations on their partnerships, but a corporation's partnership would not be successful if the NGO and potential government agency along with them is not, equal footing at the table. And actually, as a promotion for the next Google Hangout, which is on MDG 8, we'll be talking all about partnerships for development. But from Nokia funding ocean research to Starbucks working with the Food Servicing Packaging Institute, to Coca-Cola's partnership with USDA to repair national watersheds, we're seeing all sorts of partnerships that are really being highlighted and being successful. It certainly cannot be done, as we've been talking through, by business alone. We need the strong acumen and the strong knowledge that the NGOs and those types of organizations bring to the table. And I'm happy to continue listing off others, but I think the 3 or 4 that I mentioned are probably a good starting point.
Those are fantastic, and hopefully our audience can also go look those up and some other exciting examples, probably on your Twitter discussion as well.
Yes.
Chat.
Chat.
This has been a great discussion. I would say the themes that strike me are, 1, the urgency. Naysan, you mentioned that. 2 is how this really affects people on the ground. I think all too often we think about environmental problems being so big and abstract. And yet we've heard examples of how indoor air pollution is killing people around the world, other references to people's livelihoods. Depletion of the oceans isn't just an abstract thing. People rely on that for their food, especially in developing countries, and their livelihoods. That's how they make money to feed their families. So incredible connections there.
Mm-hmm. And, important call out for the oceans because, yes, the developing world heartily depends upon the oceans for their food, but we have to remember that when we look at just fertilizer in developed countries, almost all of it comes from the oceans. So I'm glad you mentioned the O word.
That's right, the blue economy. And the last theme, I think, of this chat has been partnerships. and that these are problems that affect all of us, and they need solutions from all of us. So really coming together, government, civil society, vulnerable communities, the private sector. So with that, I want to look to each of you to just give me one sentence that you want to leave our audience with, one last message. We'll do Naysan, and then Liz, and then Susan, okay?
Great.
Naysan, any last thoughts?
Did we lose
Oh,
him?
I think you're on mute, Naysan. I think you're on mute. Oh, we got Liz. Okay, maybe Liz, I think we're having trouble with Naysan's microphone. Can you give us one last thought you want to leave the audience with on MDG 7?
It would be that MDG 7 is critical to us all, and that we, all of us, citizens, civil society, and governments and the private sector need to work collaboratively to achieve this goal, or what were the objectives of this goal. And governments themselves, who still tend to work in silos, must work collaboratively and multi-sectorally within the government to achieve environmental and general sustainability.
Absolutely. All right, Naysan, are you back? Do you have one last thought you want to leave the audience with on MDG 7? Looks like we're having trouble still. Okay, Susan, I think
Sure.
It's your turn.
Okay, well, I wish I could speak for him, but I'm not as articulate or eloquent. I would say there is something really urgent to the words, it takes a village, and in this case, helping our planet is absolutely by far the most important goal that we should all be working together, business, civil society, vulnerable populations, developed populations. We are all in this together, and as I said earlier, without a planet, there are no jobs, there's actually nothing. We are Mars. So let's work together to see the results of MDG 7 come together.
Great. And with that, we have to end this panel, but obviously the momentum continues. Please continue the conversation with hashtag MDG Momentum and go to mdg500.org to see the schedule for today. Huge thanks to our panelists for joining us from all around the world and for your excellent comments. You've really given us huge insights.
Molly, you were fabulous.
Yes, thank you.
Nice.